Jennfer Swope is the David and Roberta Logie, rhymes with hoagie. She gave me the clue. I started to panic and then I saw it's in brackets. Yay, thank you. Curator of Textiles at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. She attended the Winterthur Program in American Culture as a Lois F. McNeil Fellow, receiving a master's degree in American Material Culture from the University of Delaware. Co-author and curator of Quilts and Color, the Pilgrim Roy collection. That was a great exhibition that opened at the MFA in 2014. She most recently co-authored the publication Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories. Oh my God, who got to see that? Amazing. And curated the exhibition of the same title. The exhibition opened at the MFA in October 2021, then was at the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles in November 2022. It was recently on view at the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens in Jacksonville, Florida, and will travel to the Frist Art Museum in Nashville, Tennessee in 2025. It's not too late. Amazing. Both Harriet Jacob quilts and Ibiza Butler and amazing other things from just all over, but those are the things that stand out. No photograph of a Ibiza Butler quilt conveys how it glows. That thing radiates. It's just one of the most powerful textiles, you know, it's beautiful. Anyway, wonderful exhibit, wonderful curator, wonderful speaker. Look forward to this talk. So have at it.
Oh, okay. I have to get clipped. Thank you. Well, thank you, Arden, and thank you, Alden. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. I think making meaning in memory is, I would say, a peak professional and personal experience for me, certainly in the last decade. And I hope we can come back again and gather and talk about textiles. So I will advance the slide here. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Roberts and several textiles that she made, as well as her family members, particularly her female family members, and they may have also contributed to these textiles. Generally, we're staying in the 17th century, but I promise you heirlooms and cousin marrying. So we're staying on theme. Certainly the samplers and beadwork cushion that we'll look at are testaments to the skill and artistry of Elizabeth Roberts, her grandmother, her mother, her granddaughter, and much later descendants. And I hope you'll agree with me by the end of the talk, that they reinforce these matrilineal bonds through many generations. We'll be looking at 8 family portraits that descended in this Boston family over 3 centuries, and were donated to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the Yale University Art Gallery. These treasured objects were actually created in London and brought to Boston from about the mid-1660s to 1675. And their migratory history mirrors the paths of their owners, whose wealth was based on the transatlantic trade, which we've also heard about a lot over the last 2 days. In many ways, their association with this family, thankfully, has become more documents associated with this family that shed light on these objects. Many of these documents have become a lot more accessible in the last 10 years. So I think that is an argument for continuing doing the great work that we're all doing here to go back and reassess and further contextualize these works of art. So you can see Elizabeth Roberts up on the screen. She made the embroidered samplers that we're going to discuss when she was a young girl. Probably just a few years before this portrait of her was painted in London, and before she was married to Boston merchant Samuel Shrimpton in 1669 in London. She came of age in the period of the Commonwealth under the rule of Oliver Cromwell, and she was part of London's growing merchant middle class, or really upper middle class, the way we might think about it. Her father was described as an ironmonger, or really an iron merchant. His name was Nicholas Roberts, and he traded iron hardware and other very basic finished goods to the growing English colonies in North America. He probably knew Samuel Shrimpton's uncle, his son-in-law's uncle, Edward Shrimpton, who was also a London merchant. And together, he and his son-in-law, Samuel Shrimpton, were deeply enmeshed in transatlantic trading, which we'll go through. So to go back to Elizabeth Roberts and her life, to shine a light on her biography, she and most of her siblings were baptized at St. Leonard's in East Cheap. And you can see just above the, let's see, we'll try to use the pointer here. Can you see? So this is where East Cheap is. It's, oh, no. There. I see it, hold on. Here we go, look, okay, so right here, that's where East Cheap was and was rebuilt, and that's where she was baptized along with her most of her siblings. This is significant because many nonconformist families actually had their children baptized in this church. So I think that they were probably Calvinist nonconformists. About 15% of Boston merchants in this time were also nonconformists. A lot of that is very difficult to actually find documentary evidence of, so we have to rely on patterns. Certainly when she and Henry Shrimpton were married up here in All Hallows on the Wall in 1669, that was a place where many other nonconformist families married their children. The pink area in the drawing shows the area that was destroyed by the fire of London in 1666. And so probably her family moved from there just north of that pink area and stayed in the eastern side of London because that's really where most merchant families lived. It was closer to the Royal Exchange, to ports, to insurance companies and their own warehouses. So Elizabeth Roberts' native city of London was very different than the communities that most immigrants to Boston came from. So for those of you who have studied 17th century American colonial history, the story of the Puritans coming from East Anglia and forming small nucleated towns in New England is, I think, like tattooed on the inside of our heads. And I think one of the interesting things about this research in this period of time at the end of the 17th century into the very few early years of the 18th century is that it sort of challenges some of that narrative because the city of Boston was changing, certainly the city of London was changing. So the Shrimptons were really not yeoman farmers. Samuel Shrimpton's father, Henry Shrimpton, he was a brazier by trade. He came from Lincolnshire, which is a little bit north of East Anglia. And he came in 1639, and within a decade, he had actually risen from being a tradesman who described himself as a brazier to one of the wealthiest merchants in Boston, probably, again, through this connection with his uncle, who was a merchant in London. And this was something that bore out for many merchant families. So Samuel Shrimpton and his father-in-law, Nicholas Roberts, father of Elizabeth Roberts, continued this trade. So what I can tell from documents is that Samuel Shrimpton shipped New England elk and moose hides and whale oil from Madeline's talk. I got very excited to hear that. Caribbean sugar, indigo, and Brazil wood to London. And from London, Nicholas Roberts shipped a lot of hardware. So that could be anything like endless, innumerable nails, although they did enumerate them, knives, tools, hinges. So very, very, very ordinary things and commodities and none of those records shed any light on the objects that we're going to look at. And so Samuel Shrimpton's family kind of fell slightly outside of this Puritan Calvinist religious affiliation that most of their neighbors were part of. And it is, and so when Henry Shrimpton's father died, or when Henry Shrimpton died in 1666, his son Samuel Shrimpton inherited 11,000 pounds, an estate worth 11,000 pounds. So he was the richest man in Boston at that time. And with that, this man, Samuel Shrimpton, who's not he was not a member of any church in Boston, neither was his father, so they would have been considered strangers by their neighbors. They couldn't hold public office, even though they had a lot of status as wealthy merchants. Eventually, Samuel Shrimpton, he did serve in the local militia, but his only other chance at public service, which was important for a person of his economic status, came when with the appointment of the royal governor Edmund Andros during the period of the Dominion of New England that started in 1666 when the king revoked the charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So that lasted until the Boston Revolt of 1689. And you can see in this 19th century illustration of the event, the historically much maligned Governor Andros is easily identifiable by his fashionably trimmed hat in the center. Let me put that down here. Here we go. There's his hat. And I'm going to turn off sorry. He wears a fashionably trimmed hat in the center. He's like in full Regency garb and with wearing the tall boots of a cavalier. These symbols of sort of Restoration sophistication were an affront to many of Boston's merchant class who had descended from Puritans. So to Samuel Sewall, who was a very famous diarist at the time, Shrimpton and other Andros supporters he disapproved of them. And in fact, he notes in his diary that one evening they arrived to Boston, quote, in a coach from Roxbury about 9 o'clock, singing as they came, being inflamed with drink. And at Justin Morgan's, they stop and drink healths, curse, swear, talk profanely and bodily to the great disturbance of the town and grief to good people. Such high-handed wickedness has hardly been heard of before in Boston. We can all look that up ourselves. It's very, very, very accessible. The Shrimptons were also early supporters of the colony's first Anglican church. In May 1686, their house in Milton, which is just south of Boston, was the site of the first marriage performed by an Anglican clergyman in New England. Soon after King's Chapel, a congregation established by Governor Andros, was built on public burial grounds, and essentially because no one in Boston could sell land for a non-Calvinist church. So this is to give you a sense of the changes, but they weren't necessarily linear. And the relationship with the dissenting or nonconformist churches and the Anglican church presence in Boston it remains unclear. But we do know that around this time, at the end of the 17th century, many of Boston's merchant families that were descended from Puritans began to distance themselves from the stauncher aspects of their religion. Even Sewall's criticism of Shrimpton's high-handed wickedness should be placed in the context of other diary entries that are just more neutral in tone, and he describes Shrimpton's attendance at many public and private events, and even they also went out on an outing to pick chestnuts together. So essentially, I think my interpretation is that the number of estates valued in the thousands of pounds was proportionally actually very small in this community. And so it was really difficult for people to avoid each other's company. Elizabeth Roberts Shrimpton, his wife from London, was, as far as I can tell, not a member of any congregational church in Boston, but She did bequeath 15 pounds each in her will to the ministers Increase and Cotton Mather, and 20 pounds each to 3 other prominent Boston nonconformist ministers. And this is within convention. There's other evidence of wills bequeathing funds to ministers. But it notably was not done by her first husband, Samuel Shrimpton, or their son. Her father, Nicholas Roberts, wrote them a letter in April 1674, in which he stated, Mr. Chester's son, Mr. Chester's son is Mr. Chester, son of a worthy non-conforming minister. He was coming to Boston, and quote, being a stranger will be in need of advice. So if not an outright demonstration of faith, this generosity toward congregational Calvinist ministers and their families is at least an indication of both the Roberts' sympathies and perhaps their experience in London and in England after the Civil War. But regardless of religious affiliation, of course, we have to go back to land and place because it's very important in understanding the place that these families had in their communities. One of the best way to increase one's wealth and status in a community was to acquire land. And Shrimpton, with his large inheritance, one of the first things he did the year after he inherited was acquire Noddle's Island, which is now East Boston. So if you've flown in and out of Boston, you've been there, and Deer Island, which is where the water treatment plant is. Noddle's Island was purchased from an Anglican man named Samuel Maverick. And it was one of the first places that enslaved people lived in Boston. So Samuel Maverick was a slaveholder, and an unknown number of people lived and worked on this island. And actually, thanks to Emily Gavalt, who is the curator and at the American Folk Art Museum, who's recently done a wonderful publication and exhibition called Unnamed Figures. This figure in the background of Samuel Shrimpton's portrait has come to light, and actually it's been known about for many years, but I think Emily has done the most research on this figure so far. So if you remember, this painting was painted in London, not in Boston. And we know that from Shrimpton family papers that a man named Dick was an enslaved household servant for Shrimpton. And there was a person named Robin who worked for him, for whom a coat was made by Shrimpton's tailor. Certainly the figure's dress, and he's sitting at a table with an inkwell and what appear to be account books, suggests that if he does represent a real person, this might have been Shrimpton's clerk in his business, and would have traveled back and forth with Shrimpton to and from London and Boston. But clearly, and this is why we have to have more conferences, more research needs to be done on this figure and his dress to understand the family. Sorry, I'm having. I think the advancer is not quite working. I need to go back. Why is it not going back to them? Yeah. Okay. And then this goes forward.
This will go forward. You could just hit enter.
Okay, that's good. Okay, thank you.
But this is working.
Oh, it is working. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So when Samuel Shrimpton and Elizabeth Shrimpton were married in 1669, Samuel Shrimpton became the first of 3 generations, consecutive generations in his family to marry a person from Boston. Unfortunately, it's unknown if Elizabeth ever returned to London with their son, Samuel Shrimpton Jr., but we know that their son did marry his cousin, Elizabeth's namesake, her niece, from London in 1669. And then their daughter, Elizabeth and Samuel's granddaughter, the third Elizabeth Shrimpton, sorry, there are a lot of Elizabeths, she married John Yeamans of London, who had been the lieutenant governor of Antigua. These 2 portraits are among 8 that Nicholas Roberts sent from London in the mid-1670s. They stand out from the group because these 2 sitters are rendered in the most current style of portraiture at the time. While not formal companion portraits, Samuel Shrimpton and Elizabeth Roberts are both shown in these voluminous silk satin clothing, and Elizabeth's hair is fashionably curled, and she wears a lot of jewelry. Each sitter turns slightly, bringing one shoulder into view, and their faces and other 3-dimensional forms are rendered in shadow. While the painters of these 2 portraits remain unknown, they were copying essentially or influenced by the style established by Peter Lely, who was a prolific Anglo-Dutch Restoration court painter. But in contrast to the portraits, which were sent by her father, Elizabeth most likely brought her 2 samplers, both with her name stitched on the bottom, and this beadwork cushion cover with her to Boston after her marriage. Her band sampler is typical of others made by 17th century English schoolgirls. Elizabeth Roberts and her sisters probably began their education at a local dame's school where they would have learned to read and probably would have stitched a very basic marking sampler. Older girls would then go to a boarding school, usually, where they would learn to write. They would learn more advanced arithmetic and accounting, probably some basic scientific concepts, dancing, comportment, and very importantly, from a material culture point of view, they learned a lot about art and how to make art, what I think of as art. So that would included painting, quill work, and of course, embroidery. While no correspondence in Elizabeth Roberts' hand survives, we know that she was literate because her father wrote to Samuel Shrimpton, her husband, about a letter that he had received from them in which he said, "Pray tell my daughter, those few lines from her stirred my heart. I would have her write as often as she can." And I think that gives us an insight into another dimension of education for these families that we tend to think of in a very transactional economic way, but it was actually part of their emotional lives as well. In this sampler, schoolgirl Elizabeth Roberts started at the very top of the sampler with the narrow bands that she stitched in a simple floral and acorn motif using a double running stitch. So that gives it a very linear, open look. And then just below that to the figures that match each other that look like they're boxing. And then some of the floral elements, she was able to create a little bit of relief in the sampler with a detached buttonhole stitch done in white and the light blue areas. And then the very narrow lines that are the horizontal borders between the bands in the upper section, those were done with a fairly simple stem stitch that's just very densely stacked together to make a solid line. As she moved down to the middle of the sampler, the bands became more complex with embroidered double rows of green vines and a range of white, red, and blue floral motifs in what's today called a Montenegrin stitch, which is like essentially a complicated cross stitch with multiple stitches. And so what you see as you look further down the sampler is that the pattern actually becomes more complicated every time she changed directions or the angle of this meandering vine or these floral patterns. She needed to compensate within this complex stitch. And that was important because she wanted the front to look as close to the back, so not have a lot of messy carrying over stitches. Clearly, she mastered the Montenegrin cross stitch when you look at the lowest band with its very complicated floral pattern just above the alphabet line, which is a very typical format for a band sampler. And that was done in a reversible cross stitch. And then at the very bottom, you can see an area of drawn work where her initials ER, ER, ER are repeated across the bottom. And that's a sort of a completely different set of techniques called drawn thread work, where warps and wefts are cut out and then reinforced with a whip stitch, creating this nice grid that you can see. And then she filled in those blanks in the grid with dots, basically, to make this pixelated ER pattern. And that's important to understand, because she did the white work sampler second. So this was like her capstone project, which everyone can understand. But that term wasn't used in the 17th century. So here she expanded on this drawn work technique. The grid gets bigger, so it's less stable because there's bigger spaces in between it. She starts off making in the top two bands, there are variations using curved detached buttonhole stitches with its circular spider web stitches. And then they just sort of more elements are added by the middle bar when you see those sort of four abstract blossoms across the center. Those solid areas are made from a detached buttonhole stitch, so a free needle stitch. And then by the time you get down to the area that you can see on the right-hand part of the slide, the grid is the largest, so it is the least stable to make these solid areas of buttonhole stitch. She's added some picot stitches that give the outsides of these forms a little more texture, which I'm told, I don't embroider, but I'm told are the bane of embroiderers. They don't like doing those. They're very complicated. And then, so that prepared her for the very bottom bar, which goes across, which is where there in the center, she made a freehand, almost sort of vegetal form that's flanked by two vertical areas where the only part of the ground cloth that exists in that bar are the warps that go through these sort of columnar motifs on either side. So essentially that whole bottom bar, she did freehand when in a pointed aria or a lace, basically a needle lace technique without any guide of this grid. So without, it's hard to understand, I think, if you haven't actually done this yourself, but I think you get a sense of how these projects were progressed to harder, more difficult, more challenging levels. And in them, she needed, like other schoolgirls, she needed to make aesthetic choices. She needed to execute increasingly complex designs. She did this by solving essentially unforeseeable problems while she was doing the work to completion. And this sort of approach to education, this hands-on approach to education with its intellectual abstract content was very important for women like her who would eventually be running their own households and probably helping their husbands in their businesses. So it's interesting to me to look at the beadwork cushion after taking a deep dive into the samplers, because it seems a lot less demanding as far as technique goes. It's a plain weave silk background, and on top of that, rows of strands of beads are appliqued. So And these were done by English schoolgirls, although fewer of them survive compared to embroidered samplers. This one is very typical in its composition of a contemporary couple or a couple in contemporary fashionable dress who are secular. This is not a story from the Old Testament. They stand facing each other, reaching out, and amid a sort of a symmetrical arrangement of oak trees and heraldic lions, unicorns, and butterflies. And if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, the missing strand of beads, that's just the tendril off the trunk, you can see how bright this pink silk would have been originally. So this would have been a very striking composition. But it was a stock one for late 17th century needlework. And some have suggested that these pieces were made as wedding presents, and that the tree in the center represents hopes for the fertility of the couple. And maybe they were made by schoolgirls for their friends or family members, or even for themselves before they got married. When we look at it in comparison to an example at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can see that the example that was made presumably by Elizabeth Roberts, or maybe one of her sisters, is just cruder, or maybe it's simpler. She used larger beads. She didn't include figures of the 4 continents that appear in the example from the Met. And we are left to speculate as to why that is different. It could be that the Roberts had fewer resources to buy expensive materials and make a bigger cushion. It could have been Elizabeth or one of her sisters' ages at the time that she made it. But either way, it is very rare to have these survive, and let alone the MFA's cushion being associated with two samplers with known makers makes it a very rare object. The closest to Elizabeth by age was her sister Catherine, who's seen in this 19th century copy of one of the portraits that their father sent to Boston, and in 1675. And it's possible that Catherine may have made this beaded cushion for Elizabeth in honor of her first marriage in 1669. If so, it would have been all the more precious to Elizabeth because of Catherine's untimely death. In the same year that Nicholas Roberts sent the portraits to his family in Boston, he wrote to Shrimpton and his daughter, "I have sent you in a case yours and your wife's pictures," which we saw a few slides ago, "with your grandmother's," which we'll see, "and your 3 sisters." And then he goes on to write, "When your sister Catherine's was drawn, we little thought the curtain would so soon be drawn over." And it's a reminder of the significance of these objects in a time when life was actually fairly fragile. So the label sewn to the back of the cushion reads that this cushion was, quote, "probably brought from England by Robert's family in 1670, descended through Stoddard Sumner Wells families to Georgiana Wells Sargent, and by her marked in 1906. So Georgiana Wells Sargent was the donor of this, and nearly 300 textiles and examples of costume spanning the 6 generations of her family to the Museum of Fine Arts. And she was the great grandniece of Elizabeth Roberts by a factor of 5. She was also an amazing family historian, actually correcting a cousin on a lot of the genealogical information that he published. And she carefully identified many of the textiles and costume in this way. She was also an artist in her own right. She made lace, she painted, and she drew. And clearly her documentation adds another layer of meaning to this schoolgirl work of art that traveled so far over space and now time. In this group of portraits sent from London, in the mid 1670s. This is the only one marked with a date, 1670, and the age of the sitter, which seems kind of unfair to do to your grandmother, 70 years old, Mrs. Baker. And so she was the maternal grandmother of Elizabeth Roberts. We know from family correspondence that she lived in Uxbridge, which is just west of London, or she was living there when this portrait was done. Painted in a style termed Tudor Revival or Neo-Elizabethan. Here, the shadows are diminished while elements of the facial features come out and are rendered in great detail, like the collar and the book that she holds and the flowers that she holds are also very sharp. What's hard to see in the painting as it is today in its current state and in the photograph is that she's actually wearing a pointed black hat. It's hard to see in the painting itself, and it's very hard to see in my photograph, but if you look carefully, she's wearing a pointed black hat in the shadows. Apparently she was from Uxbridge and not Welsh, but more research needs to be done. And I say that because it will be important in a moment. So Nicholas Roberts described his portrait, which you can see on the left, to his son-in-law in a letter from July 1671, writing, "My picture is drawn to send to you. If I could prevail with your mother," meaning his mother-in-law, "to have hers drawn, would have it sent now, but if I cannot prevail, I shall send you mine. Therefore, tell Betty," so we know that's his name for his daughter, Elizabeth Roberts, "I have not forgot my promise." So this indicates that he had pledged to send portraits of beloved family members to Elizabeth and Samuel sometime before they married, or at least before they left for Boston. And then 3 years later, Roberts was able to write to both of them, or to Samuel, "Tell my daughter that her mother's picture is now drawn, and mine also, and I shall send them by the next conveyance." All the portraits show the sitters wearing collars trimmed with wide bands of tape lace, except for the more fashionably dressed portraits of Elizabeth Roberts and Samuel Shrimpton that we discussed earlier. A 1679 letter from her mother, Elizabeth Baker Roberts, who you see on the right, apparently describes a lace cravat and pair of sleeve ruffles that she intended for her young son, Samuel Shrimpton Jr. In this letter to her daughter, she explained that lace was very popular for children's clothing in London. So while maintaining a level of fashionable dress was important in this family's status, the imagined lace trim, it doesn't exist as far as we know, made by a grandmother for her grandson, 6 years old, living an ocean away, echoes the importance and particularly the emotional dimension of lace for this family, which is very present in their portraits. Also donated by Georgiana Wells Sargent were several pieces of silk and metallic lace that appear to be from the late 17th century. They're a combination of silk and metallic thread and would have certainly been made in a professional workshop, not at home. These furnishing textiles add to our understanding of the material culture of this family and their contemporaries in Boston and London. They also might relate to a passage in Robert's correspondence in which he asks the Shrimptons to employ, probably by indenture, a young person arriving from London. And he wrote, "Mr. Norman, who I believe was their factor or important in their trading, has ordered a boy to come to you that has been at the trade of upholsterer for 2 years. His master and he not agreeing, his mother has paid his passage, and if you like him when you see him, you are to contract with the lad yourself. The mother is poor and has no money to give him. The lad seems to be an ingenious lad, and if you want such a one, may no doubt have him. It is said he can work well at his trade." While not directly related to individual family members and who made textiles, like the two samplers and the beadwork cushion, these two pieces of lace fringe, of silk and metallic fringe, are also made from intrinsically valuable materials. And as luxury trimmings, they are in stark contrast to the more utilitarian metal goods and basic commodities that were the stock and trade of Nicholas Roberts and Samuel Shrimpton. The similarity of this tape lace collar, which I think does have some alterations to thinking about other talks this afternoon, it's very similar to the example in the portrait of Mrs. Baker. And again, this is Elizabeth Robert Shrimpton's grandmother. And I think that this suggests that the lace collar could have been made in Boston by either the sitter or perhaps the mother of Elizabeth Robert Shrimpton. In writing about textiles as family heirlooms for the April 20th issue of the Journal of the Needle and Bobbin Club, Georgiana Wells Sargent noted that the collar and samplers have been handed down in a direct line to the present owner, meaning herself. The old lady mother in her steeple hat and wearing a lace collar looks cozily down from the wall of a sunny Boston library upon a great-granddaughter in the 6th generation and refrains from showing her disapproval of the infrequency with which a needle is seen in the hand of her 20th century descendant. These words had to be read in the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum at some point. It's only taken 105 years. You know, again, this powerful ancestral presence of these textiles over many generations of women underscores that their making and their meaning in the context of this transatlantic family history of the 17th century is something that I'm excited, and I hope everyone, I hope future generations will also be excited to learn more about. Thank you so much.